Welcome to this to the keynote lecture with Olivier Blanchard. On behalf of the organizers, we are extremely happy to have Olivier Blanchard with us tonight. Olivier Blanchard will be following online and delivering his lecture online. So it's a great honor to introduce Professor Olivier Blanchard to this lecture. No need to introduce really Olivier Blanchard. Everybody knows him as very influential macroeconomist, specialized in labor economics, monetary economics, and many other topics. He wrote more than 130 articles in peer-reviewed journals, including 25 in the American Economic Review. So the outstanding scientific contribution. We all know also his famous textbooks, and I don't want to deal more on that. So currently, Olivier Blanchard is emeritus professor at MIT, where he has been teaching since 1982. Then he has been from 2008 to 2015 counselor and director of the research department at the IMF, and now is senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. You know that beyond and besides its outstanding contribution to economics, Olivier Blanchard was already very active in the public policy debate, and more recently, in the case of France, he produced with Jean Tirole a report to the French President Macron, following a request from him on the issue of climate change, inequalities, and the demography. In the last few years, Olivier Blanchard has been working on the crucial issue of fiscal policy and debt sustainability in the current low-rate environment. And of course, it is the topic of his lecture today. And I think it's very topical even now with the COVID crisis. And I'd like to thank him again for being with us tonight, this evening. And Olivier Blanchard, the floor is yours. You have 45 minutes for your presentation. Then hopefully we have time for a few questions. Thank you very much again.
Thanks for the kind words. The reason, as you said, I mean, why is it that I've decided to work on fiscal policy at this stage? It is because something really important has happened, which is the decrease in interest rates, both nominal, but more importantly, real interest rates. And this has led to two big issues. The first one is called secular stagnation. Word I don't like very much, but I think now it's set in stone. If you define the safe neutral rate as a rate which is consistent with aggregate demand being equal to potential output, so the equilibrium safe rate, then what we have at this stage is clearly a situation in which the real safe rate, which is clearly negative, is less than the growth rate, which is positive. That's the first important dimension of the environment in which we are. The second is quite different in nature, but related, which is the zero or effective lower bound, defined as the zero lower bound, defined as the fact that we can't get nominal rates to be negative, otherwise they would be dominated by money. As we've learned, we can go a bit further than that because people don't want to carry too much cash. And so now it's called the effective lower bound, which says that the nominal interest rate cannot be very negative. And given low expected inflation, this puts a lower limit on the real rate that monetary policy can achieve. It can be strictly binding, and at this stage it is strictly binding in a number of countries. You really can't reduce the nominal rate more. Or it can be potentially binding in the sense that, yes, the nominal rate is a bit positive, but if there was an adverse shock, monetary room would be very limited. I think together they really have convinced myself that together they have extreme implications for the way we we must think about fiscal and monetary policy for the way I should rewrite my textbook when I write the next edition. What I've done, given that there are so many people working and doing great jobs on monetary policy, has been to focus on fiscal policy, where at least initially there was less work. And so what I want to do in my keynote is take up 3 issues. And the whole discussion depends on what happens to interest rates. If interest rates go back to where they were a long time ago, then we will go back to the usual ways of thinking about fiscal policy. And I'm going to argue that no, interest rates are going to remain low, and the 2 constraints I've talked about are going to be whatever. And then once this is taken as given, then this says the environment looking forward is quite different from what it was in the past. And I want to look at 2 issues. The first one is fiscal space. How do we assess debt sustainability in the current environment, which is a very hot topic, in the sense that, for example, the EU has to redefine these rules. But there are all kinds of interesting conceptual issues which come up. And then, so the first is about, what debt we can sustain. The second is about what debt we should sustain. What fiscal policy should we adopt in this environment? It's not because we can have a lot of debt that we should use all the space. And so this is really a question about optimal fiscal policy. So let me plunge and take each of the 3 topics in turn. So I'm going to show you a number of graphs on rates. So the first one is very familiar, at least in spirit. It basically gives the 10-year real rates for the US, for the Eurozone, for Japan. For the Eurozone, it's reconstructed pre-Eurozone using the national rate. For Japan, so it takes the 10-year nominal rates and then uses 10-year forecast of inflation in each case. So these are forward-looking 10-year real rates. And I think that there's a number of things which come out, which just shout at you. The first one is clearly Japan got into trouble earlier than the others. It's the yellow line. But since then, the others have basically joined. What was seen as a Japanese idiosyncrasy is now general. The second is the commonality of the 3. And the third is that if I ask you to look at where the global financial crisis or the COVID crisis is, you would not see it. I mean, it's clear that it did a bit. It was actually constrained. If you think of R-star, it was constrained by the zero lower bound. But basically, you don't see it. It is clearly a long trend. One remark here, I could have made the graph even more striking by starting in 1985. But it would have been misleading. A number of people do this because 1985 is a period in which there was basically disinflation. We had very high inflation before, and a number of central banks decided to put on the brakes. So if I started in 85, it would be, the real rates then would be even higher. But it's misleading. So I started in 92, which is basically when inflation is more or less under control. But anyway, this is the fact, right? This is the fact about the past. Now, like some of you, I've been very intrigued by this paper by Schmelzing, who apparently is at Harvard, in which he has done kind of an amazing job of constructing a series for the safe real rate since 1300 or so, by starting with the rate at which the Venetians borrowed from others, and then moving from market to market, country to country. At the end, it is very much T-bills in the US, but along the way, it's many rates. And it is quite striking how basically there has been this very long decline in the real rate, basically from 1300 to today, basically nearly 10% change in the rate, which I take to mean that there are really some fundamental factors at play. If I compare the size of the decreases between this slide and the previous slide, decrease here is fairly smooth. It's about 1-2 basis points a year. In the other slide, it's more 10-15 basis points a year. So it's much stronger, but it comes on top of something which says, look, there are really deep factors. Maybe the increase in saving over time, maybe the increase in the safety or the value of safety for investors, but we have to take this into account. So I've shown you the decrease in the real rate since 1992 in the first slide. For much of what we care about, what matters is not R, but R minus G, the real rate minus the real growth rate. And there has been the story that, well, you know, because of the Euler equation and other things, the two are very closely correlated. And so some people have been looking for lower growth. I think the answer is growth has decreased a little bit, but not very much, and not at all as much as R. In general, I don't think that there is a good relation between the two, but this is an example, a sample in which there is basically no relation. So this is for the US, but if you did it for the world, it's about the same. The growth rate hasn't changed much for the world since 1992, and the real rate has decreased all over the world. So we have entered a period in which, from 2000 on, R has been much less than G, now by 3 to 4%, which is a very large amount. In history, there were other periods when R was less than G, but they were of a very different kind. They basically were due to financial repression, for example, or to unanticipated inflation, which is what happened after World War II, or to mistakes. For example, the lack of reaction to the supply shocks of the 70s. So I think we're seeing something deep, which has been there for a while, and is not a freak accident. It's not going to go away tomorrow, and we have to think about it. Now, when thinking about it, basically, you can make a long list, but you can put it in two buckets. The first one is saving investment. So more saving relative to investment, or less investment relative to saving. This would do the trick of decreasing R star. Or it can be liquidity or risk. People have become more risk averse, therefore they accept a lower safe rate given the risky rate. Or they want liquidity and they want liquid assets, which are typically safe assets. I'm not convinced that the literature really has pinned down the various effects. There are a lot of interesting papers, but they don't convince me. What I've become convinced of is that if you look at the two big buckets, saving and investment first, and then risk and liquidity in the second bucket, then you can say something, which is if you look at saving and investment, basically world saving hasn't changed much. And so this can be either there has been no shift in saving, no shift in investment, or more likely there has been offsetting shifts, both of them leading to more or less the same saving rate, but a lower R star. But that's only half of the story. It's clear that the other half is in this picture, in which what I've done is plot in the blue line the safe real rate, so it's a series you've seen already twice for the US, and then the expected rate of return for on stocks, again using the S&P 500. The way I've constructed the expected rate of return on stocks, we know that not everybody agrees about how it should be done, is basically using an extended Gordon formula. So it's the dividend price ratio plus the expected growth rate of dividends over the next 10 years. And I've proxied the growth rate of dividends by the growth rate of output on the assumption that the ratio was relatively stable. But what this shows is that the difference between the two has increased enormously. The equity, another way of saying this, the equity premium has increased quite a bit. If the stocks were still using the same equity premium as they used to, then stock prices would be even higher than the very high stock prices that we see today. So I suspect the explanation in the end, and let me just conclude on that first part. I think that, again, we are not seeing something which is going to turn around tomorrow persistently. There's clearly some deep trends. What they are, we're not sure. Saving, I think, is an important part of the story. Richer countries save more, richer people save more. Inequality, which makes more rich, more where some people become richer, can play a role. I think liquidity, the demand for liquidity has increased both for non-regulation reasons, but also for regulation reasons. And so I think that we're going to be in that mode for quite a while. Bottom lines, it's the bottom of a slide, there might be bumps. For example, I worry that the Biden stimulus was so strong and is so strong that the Fed will have to react, and basically, in order to avoid too much inflation, will have to increase the interest rate quite a bit. I mean, aggregate demand will be very strong for some time relative to supply. And so I think we may see R star increase, even increase above G, but for very short periods of time. I think fundamentally, R star less than G will be the underlying state. I think we'll be in the R star less than G for good for a long time, a decade, maybe two. I don't think we'll be at the strict effective lower bound for very long. I suspect that we'll start seeing positive nominal rates. So the ELB, the effective lower bound, will not bind strictly, but it will be there as a constraint on what monetary policy can achieve. Let me end with this part with a table. So given that there are options on in the US on 5-year treasuries and 10-year treasuries, and same thing in the Eurozone and in the UK, we can compute the probabilities that investors put, risk-neutral probabilities that the investors put on various outcomes. So I want you to look at the last column, which is the probability that they put on the nominal rate 5 years out or 10 years out being more than 4%. I think 4% is an interesting number because if we had to guess what nominal growth might be, it's 2% real, 2% inflation. So this is basically a statement about the probability that the nominal rate will be less than the nominal growth rate. And as you can see, these probabilities are very small. And if you look at the US, 5 years out, only 7% probability that it will exceed 4%. If you go to Europe, 1% probability. So the investors are very convinced that this is going to last. As we know, we shouldn't trust investors, but it's quite striking how much they believe this. So I think we have, as when we turn to fiscal policy, which is what I'm going to do now, we have to basically take as a given that R minus G is very likely to remain negative, but not with 100% probability, and therefore we have to be ready if time were to turn. So let me move to the second topic. It would be great if I've been given 45 minutes. If somebody kind of told me when I have 20 minutes left and 10 minutes left, so there are some slides I can skip and try to cover the whole ground. So that dynamics under certainty. The evidence is, yes, the rates are very low, but the current levels of that are very high. The net debt levels in advanced economies is typically above 100%. And so you have a whole range of positions of policymakers or pundits. Mr. Schauble, not surprisingly, say, well, as soon as we can, we should really reduce that. And Paul Krugman says, look, it's so cheap to borrow and we have so many things to do that we should basically be willing to increase that. So the question is, how do we think about this? So the first thing to say is there is no magic number. The 60% number, which was seen more or less as magic, just has gone down the drain. Japan is the example. Debt is 180% net, 260% gross. And the truth is, the sustainability of that is a completely different issue when the safe rate is 10%. real, or 1%. Debt service is completely different than just thinking that there's a debt number which is going to work is not the way to go. So the rest of the slide does the basic dynamics of debt and draws conclusions. This is on the certainty, and the next slide will introduce complications. But you're all familiar with a form of a debt dynamic. So in this equation, the first red one, D is the debt to GDP ratio, R is the real rate on that, G is the growth rate, D minus 1 is that ratio last period, last year, and S is the primary balance. It's a primary surplus if it's positive, and that's why I've used S. Now we can ask the obvious question, which is, okay, so what is the what do we need to do to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio? So we put D is equal to D minus 1, and that gives us the primary balance S, which is needed to keep that ratio stable. Now, when R minus G is positive, which it was in the past and is in textbooks, then you need a primary surplus. But when R minus G is negative, then you actually can run a primary deficit and stabilize the debt. So 3 propositions, kind of in increasing order of surprise in a way. The first one is, yes, you can run a primary deficit and keep debt ratios constant. So if you have a debt of 100% of GDP, you have what we have today, R minus G minus 3%, then countries can run primary deficits of 3% and not worry. You can make the proposition stronger, which is you can run actually any primary deficit, and that will increase, but it will not explode. And it comes from the fact that, you know, the first order equation has a root, which has a coefficient of D minus 1, which is less than 1. So even if you run a primary deficit of 4%, then your debt will increase, but it will converge to 150%. There is no such thing as a debt explosion, although clearly, if you increase the primary deficit a lot, the debt ratio to which it converges might be very high. But technically, there is no explosion. And then the last way of stating it is that you can, say, have a deficit for 1 year, so increase debt, and then you never have to repay, you never have to increase taxes in the future. The debt ratio will slowly go back to where it was before. So you don't have the old story, which is if you have more debt, then you have to have more taxes later. Just doesn't apply. So there's a way of selling this which says just, you know, a la Paul Krugman, I would say, just go for it, don't worry. I want to argue that, yeah, you should worry much less, but there is not infinite fiscal space. So this is the next slide. So the 2 big caveats, the first one is homogeneity, which is that R star, and therefore R, when the central banks can put R is equal to R star, is itself a function of fiscal policy. So the more you use fiscal policy, the higher R will be, and therefore the smaller the difference between R and G. And if you really push a lot, then R will become greater than G, will be in the old regime. So on the homogeneity, I don't think it's a very big issue for the kind of fiscal policies we're thinking about, but clearly there's a feedback. The other is uncertainty, which is, we're fairly sure that R will be less than G, but we're not absolutely sure. In general, there's a lot of uncertainty about S, about R, G, and so on. So I think the first thing to say is that given the uncertainty, that sustainability is a probabilistic statement. Let me offer a definition which I can actually work. What is the probability that over the next 5-10 years, I think looking beyond that, you just have no clue. If a country cannot generate a primary surplus or a primary deficit, a primary balance, I should say, sufficient to cover interest payments, R minus G times D. Right? So I think if the probability of this is small, if a country can generate a primary balance sufficient to cover interest payments with very high probability, and therefore the probability that it cannot is small, then that is sustainable. I think this is an operational definition. So what I want to do in the next 2 slides is show how you can operationalize it and then use it to draw some conclusions. So the way I would do it, if I were to look at a country, is proceed in two steps. First, I would do it on the existing policies. I would basically I would do a simulation, a stochastic simulation, in which I would make assumptions about the distribution of R minus G. So the mean is going to be negative, but it has tails. I would care about first and second moments. I would use information from the past. I would use information from whatever source. I would take into account implicit liabilities. Will the social security system need some financing from the general budget? I would use the path of a primary deficit. I would use not just the first moment, but the second moment, which is, well, what if we have another COVID episode? And I would do a simulation of that. And I would look at what happens to the distribution of debt 5-10 years out. If the conclusion is, well, the probability that debt is exploding 5 or 10 years out is very small, that's the end of the story. Basically, that is sustainable. If there's some worry that, there's a bit of a tail there where things could go wrong, R minus G is positive maybe, but S is very large, then I think there's a second step. And the step is not the same, I think, for governments and for investors. For the government, it should be, okay, we accept the days upon. These are the policies that we offer either now or to be put in place later in order to actually avoid that issue, decrease the probability that is unsustainable. I think what the investors should do is say, okay, listen to the government and say, well, do we believe you? Can you, if you basically tell us you're going to be able to increase the primary balance by 3% in a year, can it be done? If you're a coalition government, it may not be quite obvious. How much credibility do you have? How are you going to do it? One of the big factors in assessing what can be done is the maturity of the debt. And that clearly has normative policy implications, which is that if the debt is very short and you need a large adjustment very quickly, R just jumps up for some reason very quickly, then you'll have to do a very large adjustment in the primary surplus very quickly, or in primary balance very quickly. If your maturity of debt is 7 to 10 years, then you have 7 to 10 years to do the adjustment. Politically, economically, it's much easier. So maturity is really an essential part of the assessment. What's the right analytical tool? It exists. It's called stochastic debt sustainability analysis, and it has been used. It is increasingly used. I have various examples from various countries. It is not, it basically starts a conversation because we can disagree about many of the assumptions one has to make, but it organizes the discussion in a way which is useful, and sometimes it leads to very clear conclusions. In the context of the EU rules, I've argued that that's the way they should go. It will probably not be that way they want to rule, but you could think of an independent fiscal council doing the work, asking governments to respond, and then investors being able to assess what it is that they think. So this is on methodology. Let me now draw conclusions on debt sustainability today. And so I think two messages, and I think they are both important. Suppose that the main source of uncertainty is R minus G, and I think it is, because this is really what determines, the coefficient on D minus 1, whether the dynamics are exploding or not. Now, if you worry that R minus G is going to change sign, then realistic decreases in debt until this happens, so a period of fiscal austerity, will not make much difference to the probability that that is sustainable. And the reason is that, what matters is D times R minus G. D moves slowly, R minus G moves very quickly. So to be very concrete, suppose the standard deviation of R minus G is 3% over the horizon. you care about. If initial debt is 100%, then the standard deviation of what I call debt service, which is R minus G times B, is 3%. So you may have to do an adjustment of 3% if there is a one standard deviation shock. If you do really tough fiscal austerity and you decrease that to 90% of GDP, which typically would require a very serious fiscal austerity, then in the end, the standard deviation of your debt service only decreases from 3% to 2.7%. So you're nearly in as much trouble as you would be if you had not done it. This is the negative message. The positive message is that something which makes a big difference is what basically kills the tails. So a contingent plan, which is we don't do anything drastic, but if R minus GB, which in this case depends mainly on R minus G, moves up a lot, then we automatically adjust the primary balance to respond to part of it. What this does is basically decrease the distribution when the shocks are very bad. And so I think this leads to rules. If somebody really wants a rule, then rather than having the primary balance a function of debt, which is the tradition, for example, for the EU rules as they exist, what you want is have a primary surplus or a primary balance a function of debt service defined as R minus G times B. Given that you don't want to adjust the primary surplus very quickly, I suggest an equation along the lines of one at the bottom, which is that you do this with a distributed lag with the sum of the coefficients being 1. If you do this, you will avoid explosion, but you don't have to do much before you're basically confronted with a large increase in R. And I think this can do the trick much better. So for people working on rules, I think this is what has to be explored. Let me show you that slide, but probably in the interest of time, not mention it. My discussion has very much been in terms of fundamentals determining R star. But what we know is that there can be other equilibria. There's a good equilibrium in which that is sustainable with very high probability, but we know that what can happen is that investors can get scared. They can get scared that other investors will be scared, and we get a bad equilibrium in which the investors ask for a large spread, and the result is high interest rates, bad debt dynamics, and debt unsustainability. And we used to think that could only happen to emerging markets, but what we've learned is it can happen to us as well. So the question is, can they be eliminated? And I think the answer is maybe sometimes. So I'll just make the point very, very quickly. If it's a pure self-fulfilling run, kind of a sudden stop, then yes, the central bank can basically kind of commit to keeping the interest rate the same. It's a large stable investor, and it doesn't make any sense for the other investors to actually run away. So if it's a pure sunspot equilibrium, I think it works. If the increase in the rate in the sovereign bond market reflects an increased risk of default, something has happened to fundamentals, maybe not very bad, but something, then I'm not sure that central banks can actually maintain the rate or decrease the risk. And the reason is that the central banks are not outside investors. They are part of a consolidated government. So when they buy bonds and issue bank reserves, then the overall liabilities of the central government have not changed. And indeed, if investors believe that central bank reserves are safer than government bonds, then the risk premium on the existing bonds, the bonds which are still in the hands of the investors, should increase, not decrease. So I present this as a puzzle because we tend to think that these operations have worked. In the case of B, there's a good argument, which is if you do it for one country, then the argument I've given doesn't quite apply. But in general, I think there's a puzzle and there's a warning, which is I'm not sure that central banks would be able to keep the rates low or decrease the probability of unsustainability through QE if risk was the reason behind the increase in rates. Let me move to the last topic of the three, asking how much time I have, if somebody can tell me.
10 minutes, Olivier.
How much? I didn't
10
hear.
minutes.
10 minutes. I think I can probably cover most of it. Thank you. Good. So what I've talked about is basically how much debt you can issue before you're in trouble. But that's not the right question in terms of fiscal policy. The question is, what should you do? Should you issue debt? Should you not? What does it depend on? So what I want to do in this last part is discuss the welfare costs of debt, welfare costs and benefits of debt, namely kind of optimal fiscal policy, if you want to think of it this way. So let me start with something which is very familiar, which is the welfare cost of debt under certainty. Okay. So what we learned from Phelps is that there can be over accumulation of capital. There can be too much capital. There can be what is known as dynamic inefficiency. And indeed, on the certainty, what Phelps showed is that the condition for this to be true was that the rate, and there was only one rate under certainty, namely the marginal product, the net marginal product of capital, was less than G. And so if in that world, if the certainty world, R was less than G, then there was too much capital. You could then have, if you had less capital, you'd have less output, but you'd have less investment, gross investment, and more consumption. The second step was the paper by Diamond, who went one step further. He said, yes, I mean, under certainty, R less than G is a sign of capital accumulation, overaccumulation, but that can be useful in that context. That if you issue that, it's going to crowd out capital in the portfolios of people. And that's good because they are going to invest less, and therefore you'll decrease the overaccumulation, and that is good. And he showed that in his model, which is the overlapping generation model, that was good as long as R was less than G. Then when R became equal to G, then that had could not be good for everybody, could not improve the welfare of both the current generations and future generations. You had to choose. So this is a striking result in the light of the fact that R is less than G. But the question is the obvious one, which is, well, we're not in a world of certainty. We're in a world of uncertainty, and there are at least two candidates for the Diamond Phelps R star. It's the safe rate, or it's the average marginal product of capital. And that makes a difference because one is above and one is below. So this shows you the rate of return on capital measured two different ways. One dividing by the market value of capital, the other by the replacement cost of capital. And there's an interesting discussion there as to which one you should use. And it depends on your views about rents in the economy. But for my purposes, I don't need to take a stand, which is that in each year from 1992 to today, I have not extended it beyond 2017, I'm sorry about that, the marginal product has been higher, substantially higher than the real growth rate. It has never been less than 4%, the growth rate, except, this year. In 2021 has been less than 2 or 3%. So which of the two rates should you choose in assessing whether that is really good or bad? And so, as you probably know, this is what I worked on in my AEA presidential address, and I came to the following conclusions, which is that if you introduce uncertainty in an OLG model, like the Diamond model, then the direct effect of debt, namely taking wages and interest rates as given, so depends on exactly the relation between the safe rate and the growth rate. So the Diamond result just holds. The intuition is that in that world, what you can do think pay-as-you-go rather than debt. It's a little more complicated with that, but not much. Pay-as-you-go transfers is basically a safe transfer from the young to the old. And so you compare this to, a safe alternative, which is the safe rate corresponding to what you get if you invest in capital. The risk-adjusted rate of return on capital. So, very strong conclusion. Direct effects really depend. Welfare effects really depend on the R minus G, where R is the safe rate. So it looks as if that is good. The problem is the indirect effects, which is that this is going to change the wages and the rates. And without going into the math, which turned out to be a bit complex, I found that in general, the two rates matter. And in a particular case, it's actually the average of the safe rate and the risky rate. So if you go to the data, the average of the two is roughly equal to the growth rate. So what is the conclusion? And I think it's a really important conclusion, although this is very abstract, is that debt may not be good per se, in the sense it was in the Phelps case, or in the Diamond case, but it's probably not bad. It's probably not very costly for the future. In effect, the signal we're getting is that the risk-adjusted rate of return on capital is surprisingly low. This is what these low safe rates tell us. And therefore, we should not be as worried about the increasing debt as we would have been if the safe rate was much higher. So this says debt may not be very costly. I'm going to assume that it is somewhat costly, but not very costly. And I think that's the best assumption to make. Now, on the plus side, so I've argued the costs are not very high. I want to argue that the deficits are, the use of deficits, the benefits of deficits can be very high. And here, what matters is not R star minus G or R minus G, it's the ELB. It's this other constraint which says monetary policy really cannot do much. If R star is so low that monetary policy cannot achieve this because it just gets the nominal rate, to minus epsilon, and expected inflation is low, then it has to be the job of fiscal policy. And so the conclusion, I'm just not going to go through all the details here, the conclusion is this is an environment in which debt is not very costly, and the benefits of using fiscal policy to maintain aggregate demand so that it is equal to potential output are very large. We could discuss, how you use fiscal policy in this case. I don't think there's much ambiguity about the multipliers anymore. The notion that the multipliers might be negative, but fiscal austerity could actually increase aggregate demand, I don't think applies to this environment at all. So fiscal policy can be used. It can help. It can get the economy back to full employment. If you use deficits, then yes, you may have a bit more debt. Maybe not, because again, the debt dynamics are very favorable, but you could have a bit more debt, but it's not very costly. So this allows me to go to the last slide, which is, where are we today? I think the effective lower bound is strictly binding in nearly all countries. And secular stagnation is very much there. R star, which is less than R, is much less than G. At the same time, we have very large deficits. We had very large deficits in 2020, but even in 2021, there are forecast to be about 8% of GDP for the major advanced economies. So I think the conclusion from what I've said is until we get out of COVID, whatever it takes, used now not for monetary policy but for fiscal policy. So whatever it takes for protection to maintain aggregate demand, these are two different dimensions, should be done. If there is a need for public investment, then by all means, use it to sustain both aggregate demand in the short run and supply in the medium run. Just go for it. The interesting question is what happens, maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year or two. Aggregate demand, I think, is going to become a bit stronger. And so there's going to be a bit of an increase in R star. R star moves with aggregate demand. I don't think it's going to be greater than G by a lot, but it will be a bit smaller. I don't think the ELB will be strictly binding, but there will not be enough margin for monetary policy to actually do the work by itself. So it will still need fiscal policy in a big way. Now the question is, and we're probably not very far from this, hopefully, which is as aggregate demand becomes stronger, then you can think of two extreme cases. You can basically think of keeping the rates as low as you can and decrease deficits at the speed that the increase in aggregate demand allows. So the aggregate demand becomes a bit stronger. You do slightly tighter fiscal policy, but you keep the rates at zero. Or you can actually keep the deficits, which means that then the increase in aggregate demand plus the deficits will increase interest rates, and therefore it will increase the neutral rate, and the central bank will be able to increase the actual rate. So you have this choice between decreasing deficits and keeping rates very low, or decreasing deficits less and allowing for an increasing rate. I would argue that it would be a good thing to actually be able to increase rates a bit, to have more room for monetary policy. So it has to be a combination. It doesn't look like it's the way it's going to work out in the US. I think that what we're going to see is very much the second of the two options, with the Fed doing the adjustment without much of an adjustment in deficits, but I could be wrong. One last remark, if I still have a minute, which is there is a case which worries me very much because it looks a bit like Japan. Suppose that aggregate demand remains very depressed, the way it was before COVID, and so the effective lower bound remains strictly binding, and we have to have very large deficits year in, year out in order to sustain demand, and the deficits are so large that that keeps increasing. Again, if you look at Japan, we're not very far from that. The question is, at some stage, even by my standards, that will be too high. And so the question is, are there other ways of increasing private demand short of basically using public demand? My sense is yes, and we should be thinking about it already, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of saving is precautionary saving. For example, the lack of health insurance in the US. So I suspect, for example, that implementing the whole Obamacare or Medicare for all would actually have a good effect on saving. It would decrease them, it would increase demand, and would be a much better way of solving the problem than running deficits. It varies from country to country. Some countries already have a lot of social insurance. But I think we have to think, if this continues, then we probably can't have very large deficits forever. And we'll have to think about other ways. So let me stop here. Let me just say that all this reflects a book that I'm trying to finish, which has much more detail and should be available later this year. But let me stop here and stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Olivier, thank you very much for... Thank you very much for this stimulating lecture. And I didn't know you were writing a book, but I'm surely looking forward to reading it. We have a little bit of time for questions now, so let me ask the audience if there are any questions. Agnès Benassi has a question.
Hi, Olivier. I was especially pleased that you addressed this question of the normalization of the policy mix with your two extreme options of either keeping interest rates very low and adjusting the deficit, which seems to be the direction that is going to be taken by the euro area, more or less. Or the other extreme where you keep deficits and you adjust the rates, and this could be the path followed by the US. So you say the best solution is in between. I have difficulties in figuring out what it means in practice, because the UK has announced some form of double down, with raising both interest rates and the balance, so reducing the deficit. So is that what you have in mind? And also, in the euro area, so of course the euro area is not just one country, so there is a risk of various speeds of adjustment of the deficit, which would raise some maybe some questions about some risk premiums, which we also have to take into account.
Would you like to respond to that immediately, Olivier?
Yeah, I prefer to respond to questions as they come. Thank you, and yes, I think you're making a very good point, which is that it's hard to tell, but the EU and the US are going to take different routes, and we'll have to see how it works out. The UK, at some conceptual level, is doing a mix of the two, but I'm not going to give my approval to UK economic policy at this point. Why would you want to do a bit of the two? Well, there are two reasons which are somewhat different. The first one is, if you think that R much less than G as an indication that debt is not bad, then, you know, other things equal, you may want to continue deficits for a while, right? If we were sure that R minus G was a sign of accumulation of capital, I've said we're not, but if we were, and the further away we are, the larger the difference, the more likely it is, then I think you should feel free to continue deficits for a while. The other reason, so that basically takes you in the direction of more, you know, sustained deficits, and therefore the ECB having to basically increase rates to avoid inflation. The other reason is to increase the margin of maneuver of the central banks in general. It seems to me that, you know, I would love if we return to nominal rates of 5 or 6%. This would give kind of the usual room of maneuver when there's at least a run-of-the-mill recession. So I would worry if, you know, if the central bank stayed at zero or negative while the deficits were adjusted on the way down. It seems to me that, you know, some adverse shock is going to come, and I'd rather have monetary policy be able to help a bit. But these are the questions that I think we have to start thinking about for, you know, the next year, I guess.
There's a question by Olivier Garnier.
Hi, Olivier, and thanks for the nice presentation. A question about what you said in terms of fiscal policy rules. If I understand well, and a kind of a simplistic interpretation would be, in the European case, you do not recommend a debt to GDP rule, saying that, for instance, in your example, it was costly to get, for little gain, to get from 100 to 90. At the same time, you recommended a kind of feedback mechanism from interest payments to the primary balance. Does that mean that, again, being very simplistic, in the European case and with the 60% and 3%, that a deficit rule with a, for instance, with a 3% target or cap would be better, because in that case you have an implicit feedback mechanism from the interest payments to the primary balance if you have this kind of deficit ceiling or target. So it would be a kind of a reversal of history, because initially we went from the 3% to the 60%, and now going back maybe to the 3% in a context where R is below G.
No, I mean, you have a point in that the 3% becomes more relevant than the 60% target, but the 3% is a very bad way of doing things. Because if you think basically of keeping, just take the extreme case in which you move a primary balance with debt service. If debt service is negative in terms of R minus GP being negative, then I want to allow for a primary deficit of, say, 3% today without, you know, any rule being broken. So I think that the shift from a stock to a flow is a good thing, but I don't think that the 3% is of any interest. It seems to, again, I think the right target should be I mean, that is stable. That will not explode if you can generate a primary balance, which is sufficient to cover interest payments defined as R minus G times B. That, I think, is the essence. And it seems miles away from 3%, 60% rules. As you know, I mean, I'm basically not in favor of any rule because I've argued that the exercise that you do, for example, when you do an SDSA, is so complex and so specific to the place, to the country, to all kinds of things, that simple rule is not going to work. But I'm not the person who is going to decide, and therefore I suspect there will be rules. And if there's a rule, I would like it to be focused on reaction of the primary balance to that service. This has one shortcoming, which is that if you write the rule, this tends to create a unit root for debt, so that debt can go anywhere. So I would also have some small feedback of the level of debt on the primary balance. But it would be a very small feedback, not at all the 1/20th type thing that exists in the EU rules.
Very much. Are there any other questions? I think we have no other questions, Olivier. Then let me thank you again for a great and stimulating lecture. And we're looking forward to your book.